In video 3 for Unit 8, we're going to be focusing on World War II. Just like in World War I, when World War II started, the United States tried to stay neutral. In fact, we passed a series of neutrality acts saying we were not going to get involved in the war. However, as threats in Europe and in the Pacific became bigger and more desperate, the United States started looking for ways to help. For example, FDR pushed for what became known as the Lend-Lease Act, which was an act that allowed us to supply company or countries that were strategic to us, which were basically allies, with supplies. Now, the Lend-Lease Act is kind of walking a fine line between neutrality and actually breaking neutrality, but it was a way for us to help without technically getting involved in the war. One of the things the Lend-Lease Act does show us, though, is that time went on as things got more desperate in Europe and as the Japanese continued to expand, the United States was inching closer and closer to getting involved in the war and probably would have had we not been attacked. What was the purpose of the Lend-Lease Act and what did it show about America's neutrality? Now, as the war expanded in Europe, we started prepping back home just in case we got pulled into it. And then with things like the Lend-Lease Act, we started creating supplies for other companies, or excuse me, other countries. So there were a lot of jobs being created. However, a lot of these jobs were being offered first to white males. This is still during the Great Depression. We're not out of the Great Depression yet, so this is a big deal. And these jobs are very important, and yet a lot of groups, again, are being left out. A. Philip Randolph was a civil rights leader who was trying to protest against this discrimination by organizing a march on Washington, D.C. Now, President Roosevelt did not want to see the nation split over racial issues, so he issued an executive order telling war industries that you can no longer discriminate against different groups. You have to offer these jobs to everybody. Well, this was a big encouragement to A. Philip Randolph, so he called off his march. But as time goes on, a lot of these companies ignored this executive order. This cartoon on the right is a Dr. Seuss cartoon. Before he became famous with the Cat in the Hat and Green Eggs and Ham and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, he was a commentator through political cartoons on lots of issues, social and political issues of the 1930s and 40s. This cartoon is called The Old Runaround. To give somebody the runaround is to promise them something, but yet to never follow through with it. And we've all probably had somebody give us the runaround before. If you look at this cartoon, at the front here it says Negro job hunters enter here. And in the middle are these US war industries with all those jobs. But yet if you follow the maze here, there's actually no way for these job hunters to actually get to the jobs. So this is Dr. Seuss being critical of these companies saying you're promising people jobs, but yet you're not actually following through with it. So why was A. Philip Randolph threatening to organize a large march on Washington, D.C.? And what was the executive order supposed to do that FDR issued as a response to this proposed march? Now, the United States officially enters World War II after we were attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. It was a surprise attack in the fact that they attacked Hawaii because that was not what America was expecting. But it wasn't surprising Japan attacked us in general because the United States and Japan were very upset with each other. In particular, the United States had been upset for a long time about Japanese expansion into places like China, Korea, and other areas of the Pacific Ocean. Now, the Lend-Lease Act and other things kind of showed Japan that we were inching closer to getting involved in World War II, so they decided to attack us before we actually had the chance to join the war. Their goal was to try to knock us out for a couple of years so they could then do what they needed to do to expand their empire without us being able to stop them. Over 2,400 Americans were killed in the attack at Pearl Harbor. And as you see here in this picture of the USS West Virginia, a lot of our ships were destroyed. Now, this attack by Japan set off a lot of fears across America, especially against Japanese Americans. A lot of people thought Japanese Americans were uh, enemies or dangerous because of their heritage. And so President Roosevelt issued an executive order 9066, which said that Japanese Americans could be taken away from their homes and put into internment camps. And over 110,000 Japanese Americans were moved to these camps. There are also some German and Italian Americans that had the same thing happen to them. So you look over here on the right, the map here shows you where some of these camps are at. and they're very far away from major population centers, out in the middle of nowhere. And as you look at the bottom right, you see the condition of these internment camps. They were not very nice places. So people taken away from their nice homes and forced to live in these places sometimes for over 2 years. Now, the question about this, number 1, was it necessary? The answer to that is no. There was really hardly any proof at all that any Japanese Americans were spies or were loyal to the Japanese during World War II. That was just a fear that, there was no basis for it. Number 2, is it even legal? Can you do this? Japanese Americans were American citizens. Can you do these type of things to American citizens? And the answer to that is no, this should not have been done. But during the war and with all the fears that were going on, America and the Supreme Court said this was okay. Now, most of the stuff we talk about in World War II were amazing things that happened in America. This is not one of them. This is kind of a black eye on the United States. Looking back on this, we now see that this was something where we went too far and we denied thousands of American citizens their rights. So the United States entered World War II after which naval base was attacked? How did this attack lead to FDR's Executive Order 9066? And why were internment camps so controversial? Now, one of the big issues for the United States when it came to fighting the Japanese is the fact that we're doing this all the way across the Pacific Ocean. And if you look at this right here, the Japanese had taken over thousands of square miles of area in the Pacific and also in Southeast and East Asia. So we've got to get our troops, our supplies, our weapons across the ocean. And then we've got this situation where we can't actually even attack Japan itself because they control this whole area. So the United States came up with island hopping. The plan was to go island by island until we got close enough to actually start attacking Japan itself. And then eventually the decision would have to be made, are we actually going to invade Japan? And again, that was called island hopping. So, what challenges did the United States face in trying to fight the Japanese in the Pacific theater? And what was the name of the strategy the U.S. military followed because of these challenges? Now, the Japanese had planned to knock us out for 2 years, yet just 6 months into World War II against Japan, the turning point battle happened at what was called the Battle of Midway. The United States had actually intercepted some intelligence, so we knew the Japanese were planning an attack, but even still, finding ships in the Pacific Ocean back then was like finding a needle in a haystack. The United States was outnumbered at this battle, yet at the end of the day, the Japanese had suffered major losses. The most devastating part of Midway for the Japanese was they lost 4 aircraft carriers. These aircraft carriers are what the Japanese had been using to attack places like Pearl Harbor. So Midway changes the tide of the war because the Japanese can no longer attack like they had before. Now they're forced to go on the defensive, and this allows the United States to be able to implement island hopping and go after the Japanese. This is still considered one of the most surprising and amazing victories in history. The Battle of Midway is called the turning point in the war against Japan. What happened to the Japanese naval navy at Midway, and how did it change the way that they had to fight? Now, eventually, we got to the point where the decision had to be made, are we going to invade Japan? The estimates of losses for Americans was around 1 million troops possibly lost, killed, captured, or wounded in an actual invasion of Japan. But while all this was happening, the United States had created the largest top secret project in American history called the Manhattan Project. This was the code name given to the atomic bomb project. And by the time we get to the point of having to make the decision to invade Japan, we have the atomic bomb. At this point, FDR had passed away in Warm Springs, Georgia, and his vice president Truman had taken over, and he has to decide, do we actually use this new weapon? The main reason that Truman gave for dropping the bomb was by dropping the bomb on Japan, we were actually saving lives. Because if we could avoid an invasion, thousands of American lives would be saved, and probably a lot of Japanese lives in general. Now, after the second bomb was dropped on Japan, they agreed to surrender, and the war came to an end. Now, this was a devastating weapon, a controversial weapon, but it does lead to the Japanese surrender and World War II ending. What was the code name for the atomic bomb project, and what was the main reason President Truman decided to use the bomb against Japan? Now, in Europe, the United States faces similar situations when it came to trying to fight in the European theater. This red area shows the area that the Nazis controlled by the time we get involved in World War II. So the problem for us is we cannot get an army into Europe to actually fight Germany itself because they control this whole area. So the United States is going to have to plan an invasion into Europe across water, and we'll be looking at that in just a few minutes. So, what major challenges did the Allies face in trying to defeat the Germans in the European theater? The moment that changes the war in Europe happened on June 6, 1944, in the D-Day invasion. This is an invasion that had been planned for years. The United States and the Allies are going to come across from Great Britain, across the English Channel by water, and land on these beaches in Normandy, France. Now, this was a very difficult proposition. First of all, coming from water because you couldn't retreat. And number two, the Germans had been preparing for this for years as well. So these beaches are heavily defended. This was a very devastating invasion. A lot of American and Allied troops lost their lives, were wounded. But by the time we get to the end of the first day on D Day, the whole tide of the war had changed. Now, we're invading France here. Just to clarify, we're not upset with France. France had actually been taken over by Germany. So we're trying to help free France. And once that is done, we can actually attack Germany itself. Now, these are some pictures from D-Day. This is a Higgins landing craft that a lot of the soldiers were dropped off on onto these beaches. They had to make it all the way across this very wide beach. Along the way, there's barbed wire, there's landmines, and then it's hard to tell here, but at the top of this, these are cliffs. And up here on the top of the cliffs are Germans with machine guns that are just shooting back and forth against these guys as they're trying to make it across. Eventually, so many Allied troops land on the beaches, they overwhelm the Germans, and a few days later, these are what those same beaches look like. These are American ships, American tanks, American trucks, troops, and supplies coming in massive numbers. And this allows the United States and our allies to actively go after Germany with an actual ground army in Europe. The D-Day invasion is often called the turning point in the war in Europe. Why was this invasion so important? The invasion was in Normandy, France. France was our ally, so why did we invade France? Now, the final battle of World War II in Europe is the Battle of Berlin. Berlin was the major city for Germany, and the United States and the Allies are coming from the West, and the Soviets were coming from the East. This is where Hitler commits suicide and the Germans surrender. So, the significance of the Battle of Berlin is it is the final major battle in Europe in World War II, where the Germans surrender. But another significant thing about the Battle of Berlin is that it's going to become a symbolic city. As the Soviets come in from the east, they start implementing communism in all the areas they march through as they're fighting Germany. And they're also going to implement communism in this part of Germany. And it's going to lead to a split Germany during what we're going to talk about in Unit 9 called the Cold War. What was the significance of the Battle of Berlin as it relates to World War II? Now, here in the United States, the war had a major impact on the lives of Americans. One of the biggest impacts was that all the things that the soldiers needed, all the ships and planes and jeeps and even things like medical supplies had to be created. And so millions of Americans are put to work making war material. To make sure that everything that was needed was being created and that we weren't making too much of one thing, the government set up the War Productions Board. The War Production Board told companies what they needed to be made for the war effort. For example, here we see a Ford car plant where this Ford company had been told by the War Productions Board, hey, we need tanks. So they quit making cars and they started making tanks for the war effort. A lot of companies that made non-essential goods transitioned into making war supplies during this time. Another thing that a lot of Americans did, or things that Americans did, during World War II had to do with war conservation movements. For example, scrap metal drives for people to go out and gather up scrap metal that could be sent to be melted down to make new tanks and planes out of. People carpooling or walking or riding bikes to conserve gasoline. Some Americans even planted things called victory gardens. These were small little plots where people would plant just a few plants. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but if millions of Americans were doing these little gardens that normally didn't grow their own food, well, that's a lot of food being produced. And during the war, there were a lot of things that were hard to get. Matter of fact, some things were so hard to get, the government instituted what was called rationing. And this wasn't voluntary, this was done by the War Productions Board. How rationing worked was that your family was given a book each month with these coupons that equaled certain amounts of points that would allow you to buy things like gasoline, sugar, meat, and canned vegetables. However, those points were limited, so once you used your points up, you could no longer buy those goods until the next coupon book rolled around. So it forced people to have to be very careful about buying certain goods and limited the amount of goods that people could buy. Certain things, not everything was rationed during World War II, but things that were difficult to get were. What was the purpose of the War Productions Board, and what are some examples of ways that people in the home front tried to conserve things during World War II? And how did rationing work? Now, a lot of groups played major roles in World War II that didn't get a lot of credit for it. For example, women and African Americans made major contributions to World War II, although they oftentimes were discriminated against. Women weren't allowed to fight in the actual war itself, yet thousands of them joined the military in all kinds of support roles, and that's something you oftentimes don't hear about. This was very important for the war effort. Back home, a lot of groups that had not been allowed to get jobs before now are desperately needed. And so, for example, women were asked to come in and do jobs they had never done before. An example of this was this famous campaign called Rosie the Riveter, trying to encourage women to get involved in heavy industries, doing things like rivets, welding, machining, stuff that women never would have dreamed of doing before. But without all these different groups here in America helping support the military and support roles, helping produce goods and weapons and supplies, our troops could not have been as successful as they were in the war. So the home front, the groups back home, made a major contribution in our soldiers being able to win the wars in the Pacific and the European theater. So, what were some of the contributions that women and African Americans made during World War II?